The morning the floor seemed to breathe. Helen had been standing over the living room like a foreman, cardigan sleeves pushed to the elbows, smart eyes narrowed to a decisive squint. She was 68, the sort of woman whose palms carried the geography of kitchens and gardens and PTA bake sales, and she had finally decided to do what the contractor kept advising: lift the boards, shore up the joists, and run new electrical before one more lamp flickered with a whisper of danger. The house, a shingled survivor on a tree-lined street in the Bay Area, had once belonged to her father, then to Silence, then to her. It came with quirks: a dining room that had been a porch, a closet that insisted on locking itself, and a living room whose oak planks had acquired a faint tidal rise over the last decade, especially after heavy rains. "Subterranean spring," Louis the contractor liked to say, tapping the wood with a knuckle. "Or a buried root. We'll know when we know." But they knew before lunch. The first boards lifted easily, giving up a century's hoarded dust with the sigh of an old woman unburdening a secret. Beneath lay tamped earth, a compacted layer of sand and clay that had once been outdoors and now served as underworld. A worklight threw a golden circle across the dark. Luis slid on his knees, pushing a trowel into sand that looked undisturbed since the house took its first breath. 2 joists in, the trowel rang faintly. A bell struck underwater. "Stone?" Helen asked. "Not here," he said softly, and brushed with the care of a man who has found his share of bottles and marbles and unlucky nails. The sand gave way to smooth metal. No, not metal. Something pale and calm that answered the light without glare. Lead, Helen thought without knowing why. Her father had been a machinist. The word came to her tongue on the old fingerprints he left on wrenches and stories. She knelt beside Luis, cardigan grazing dust like a flag lowered to half-mast. They cleared the top first, a rectangle the size of a coffee table, then larger, then, undeniably, the length of a child. The edges were seamed with strips of dull grey. There were hinges at one end and, maddeningly, 2 small oval windows the size of a palm, stained brown from the inside like honey turned to amber. The worklight washed across the lead's tired glow and made the ovals glimmer, and somewhere a train wailed, as if the world, catching its own reflection in the moment, felt compelled to narrate. Luis sat back. "Senora," he said, though she'd told him a dozen times to call her Helen. "It's a coffin." They did not touch it. Not yet. A wide, disciplined silence moved in, the kind that remembers church. Helen pressed her hand to her sternum and felt a small, steady animal there, her heart, but also something older, a muscle made of mothers. "Stop work," she said. "Please." She reached for her phone, then changed her mind and reached for a chair instead, because chairs understand how to hold people who are suddenly heavier than themselves. The city would need to be called. The police, perhaps. A coroner, certainly. This was not a home repair anymore. It had become a rescue, a retrieval, a correction of an error committed by time and men with shovels. But first, oh, first, the human impulse, as ancient as grief, to make sure she had seen what she was sure she had seen. Luis angled the light, wiped a sleeve across one of the ovals and peered. "It's fogged," he murmured. From inside. He took a breath, then stepped back, leaving space as if air could do polite things. "Do you want—" he asked, offering the light with his look. "No," said Helen, which meant yes, eventually, but not before she told the room who she was. She spoke out loud, because decency sometimes requires voice. "My name is Helen Morris," she said to the dark and the lead and the oak boards, leaning like tired people against the wall. "This is my house. If I've been living on top of you, I'm sorry." Then, with a tenderness she had used on sleeping infants, on the slick backs of tomatoes after the first rinse, on her father's cheek the day the nurse called her by her mother's name, she bent and cupped her hand around the oval and looked through. For a moment she saw nothing but a smear of her own grey hair and the lamp's hot circle. Then her eyes adjusted to a smaller theatre. A child's face, sweet and undecorated by fear. The features were soft, the skin the color of candle wax, the eyelids settled as if between one breath and the next. Wisps of hair lay like pale threads across the forehead, held by a ribbon that had forgotten its hue. In the second oval, a hand, tiny fingers laced with dried blossoms that looked like pressed stars. A dress, high-necked, with tiny buttons marching under the chin, no decay visible, not in the narrow compass the ovals allowed. The child could have been sleeping after a long summer picnic, damp with creek water, weary from joy. Haunting, Helen thought, not as a synonym for terror, but for the way beauty can ache. Haunting, the way the past sometimes stands up in your living room and says, "See me correctly." "Don't," Louise said softly, hearing the shape of her breath. "Don't be alone in your head with that. I'm right here." They replaced the boards enough to turn the room back into a room, called the non-emergency line, and explained with the steadiness of people who had stumbled into an old poem. Officers came, then the medical examiner's office, then a woman in a blazer who introduced herself as Dr. Morales from the county. She had the flat shoes and bright, practical eyes of a person who has seen what people mean when they say the word remains. Morales crouched. "Lead-lined coffin," she said. "19th century, most likely. The ovals are viewing panes. Sometimes they used mica, sometimes glass. Sometimes people put flowers inside, or a lock of hair from a sister. Often these were placed in vaults. The preservation can be extraordinary." "Under a house?" Helen asked. "Before there was a neighborhood," Morales said gently. "There was a cemetery. In this city, most were moved after 1900, when land became something men wanted to pretend belonged to them more than to their memories. Individuals were exhumed and transferred. Families that could pay paid. Others were lost in paperwork and haste. Contractors missed graves. Some were left behind. It happens more than we admit." "Left behind," Helen repeated, and felt indictments begin to stand in line, of greed, of speed, of the arrogance that writes receipts on top of bones. "She's been here at least a century," Morales nodded. "Roughly. If your house was built in 1912, as the permit says, then the grave predates it. She may have been buried around 1880. That would make it about 145 years. The number found its mark in Helen's chest, a clean, almost mathematical sorrow. 145 birthdays unattended, 145 springs that did not ask her bones whether they wanted sun. She looked at her hands, at the narrow map of veins, and realized she was older now than any mother who had wept at that grave then. The county took photographs, noted measurements, and explained the procedure. The coffin would be carefully raised. The child, if preserved sufficiently to require it, would be handled with dignity and law. They would look for any inscription, any coffin plate, any identifier to move the story from guess to name. It could take days. It could take months. "But I promise you," Morales said, the way good doctors promise without lying, "we will not treat her like an inconvenience. We will treat her like a person who needs to go home." Helen nodded and learned something specific about her own spine. It could hold the weight of someone else's lost century without collapsing. The next morning the crew returned, this time with gloves, brushes, straps, and the hush you bring to rooms that once were churches. The oak boards came up and were stacked like well-behaved children against the wall. Neighbors arrived at the sidewalk with curiosity softened by respect. Ms. Patel from 2 doors down, who left a Tupperware of sag paneer on the porch, the young couple with the toddler who waved at everyone, the retired history teacher whose voice kept lacing fact with apology. The news spread along the block without siren or social media blast. A girl had been found, a girl from when the streets were fields, a girl with the patience of centuries. They lowered a sling under the coffin with a slow choreography. The lead creaked with the fatigue of time. The straps groaned their complaint. The sand let go the way it always does, reluctantly and then all at once. When the coffin rose, it was like a breath held too long finally being released. The ovals caught the light again. The child slept on. On the underside, exposed for the first time to daylight since Rutherford B. Hayes was president, a small oval plate glinted, dark with oxidation. A coffin plate. Morales brushed it with a soft eraser, the way curators brush history, and letters began to show. M-A-R, then the curve of an I, then A. Maria or Mary. Beneath, the faint scratch of numbers. 1880. The rest dented, unreadable. Maria, Helen whispered, though her father's voice in her head, old Irish-American, would have said Mary without asking. It might be either, a name shared by a dozen languages like a loaf divided and passed down a row of hands. But for now, Maria hovered on the metal like a rumor turning into a word. Please, Helen said, surprising herself, because she had never been a please and thank you to heaven sort of woman. Please let us find her people. Morales nodded as if to add an amen and motioned to her team. Let's do this, she said, gently. The coffin moved through the living room, across floors that had been laid over its sleeping decades, past photographs of Helen's father in a navy uniform, a ceramic bowl of lemons, a shelf of library mysteries, into the light of the front door. For one strange second, the neighborhood looked the way it must have looked when the land had been a field with stones at one edge and flowers at another. For 1 second, time said, "Okay, I can be hospitable." They slid the coffin into the van. The back door closed with a sound like obedience. A sparrow landed on the eave. Somewhere a baby laughed, as babies do when life invents itself for the 1000th time. The van pulled away, and the house suddenly felt newly hollow, as if it had given up a part of its foundation and would have to learn how to stand again on truth instead of error. Luis touched the brim of his cap. "We'll fix the floor, Senora," he promised. "We'll make it strong. But first, let's fix the story." Helen stood on the porch with her cardigan wrapped around her like a declaration and watched the van until the street took it. She did not cry. She would later in the useful way tears can rinse a person enough to be of service. For now, she went back in, picked up the lid of a shoebox, and wrote a label in careful black marker, "For Maria." Into it, she put the flowered dish towel that had covered the work light, a small ribbon from her sewing basket, and a folded note she did not reread. "You are not forgotten. We will find your name. We will say it out loud." Outside, the neighbors went home with quieter feet. Inside, the house exhaled, and the space under the living room learned the exact weight of air. The county lab sat in a building with the practical charm of a lunch pail. Dr. Morales met Helen in a small conference room that held a carafe of coffee, a box of tissues, and the kind of chairs that promised nothing but endurance. On the table lay a folder with the county seal and a slim stack of photocopies, a death index from the 1880s, a list of exhumations from the early 20th century when cemeteries were moved out to Colma, a brittle reprint from the Alta California describing a summer of fever. Beside them, a clear bag held 2 items, a dried sprig of something that had once been lavender, identified by a botanist with a magnifier and a sigh, and a tiny locket no bigger than a thumbnail. "We don't open the coffin unless there's legal necessity," Morales said. "Lead keeps out oxygen. If we break that seal, we change everything." But the viewing panes gave us enough to confirm. A girl, 5 to 7 years old. The dress is consistent with the period. The flower in her hand likely lavender or myrtle, both common in Victorian mourning, both symbols that say what words couldn't. She paused, eyes kind. "We will not show you photographs. They aren't necessary, and they can injure the heart." "I've already seen her," Helen said, "in my floor." The memory arrived not as a picture, but as an instruction. "Be steady." "What about the plate? We thought we saw Maria." Morales slid a photo across. Up close, the plate was a planet of oxidation with a continent of letters. M-A-R-I-A were clear enough, the rest an archaeological murmur. Beneath, a date, 1880. No day, no month. On the lower edge, the treacherous ghost of a surname. Perhaps an O, perhaps nothing. Here's what we know, Morales said, turning to the papers. Between 1870 and 1890, this city experienced waves of diphtheria, scarlet fever, and smallpox. Children bore the brunt. Cemeteries on the west side and in what used to be the Mission District received hundreds of burials. Beginning around 1900, most of those graves were exhumed and moved. Records from that period are uneven. Some ledgers were kept with care. Some were lost in relocations. Some never existed beyond the back of a foreman's mind. The ledger from St. Bartholomew's, which once stood within a half-mile of your house, lists 3 Marias buried in 1880. Maria Jensen, age 6. Maria O'Shea, age 5. Maria Del Valle, age 7. Helen tasted the names as if they were fruits she might set in a bowl and keep fresh. Jensen, O'Shea, Del Valle. Each spoke of ships and shorelines, of languages touching, of beginnings that did not get to continue. Do we know where they were moved? 2 were exhumed in 1912, Morales said, reading. Jensen to Colma. O'Shea, no destination listed. Family unable to be found is scrawled in the margin. Del Valle, transfer requested, no follow-up. It's possible, she added, careful to lean on the word possible, the way a person leans on a railing that might not bear their weight, that your Maria is one of these. It is also possible she belongs to a family whose paperwork failed, or whose name was misspelled into disappearance. The retired history teacher, whose name, it turned out, was Keegan, had already brought Helen photocopies of old maps showing the boundary lines of the vanished cemetery. He arrived at the lab now, hat in hand like a man entering a wake. I called a friend at the Historical Society, he said. He found a funeral home register from 1880. Look. He laid down a page, thin and exhausted by time. In faded ink, May 17th, 1880. Miss Mary O., the rest a smear. Under cause of death, diphtheria. Undertaker, M. Hanrahan and Son. Interred, St. Bartholomew's. Plot 12, child section. Mary, not Maria, Keegan said, as if apologizing to the air. But you know how it was. Clerks wrote the name they had in their ear. In Irish families, Mary is near guaranteed. In Spanish-speaking families, Maria is the same saint by another syllable. With the plate showing M-A-R-I-A, I leaned toward a Spanish surname. Del Valle would fit the neighborhood's immigration then, but O'Shea might have had a mother who called her Maria at home. We can't be sure. Helen did the thing women do when presented with uncertainty. She organized what could be organized. Can we look for an obituary? She asked. A notice. Beloved child, services at... Morales smiled the weary smile of someone who has wrestled good out of microfilm. We can try, she said. But obituaries for children in working-class families were rare. Printer's ink cost money. Grief often took the form of attendance at a wake, not newsprint. Keegan tapped the locket's bag. This might tell us something, he said. Victorians loved lockets with hair. If there's hair inside that doesn't match the child's, it might be a mother's lock, darker, grey, different texture. It would be a poem without words. We won't open it, he added quickly to Morales, without your say-so. We can X-ray it, Morales said, relief visible. We can see the inside without breaking it. If there's a photograph, sometimes they survive in ghostly outline. They X-rayed, they magnified, they tilted the machine's head as if asking it to be generous. The image that bloomed showed a small coil, the suggestion of hair tucked against a paper oval. No face resolved, no saint's card announced a name. But hair was something. Hair was inheritance stitched into a circle. Hair was a mother saying, here is part of me to go with part of you. Back at the house, with the joists braced and the floor still open to the square of earth that had cradled a coffin like a final kindness, the neighborhood convened informally. Ms. Patel brought tea sweet enough to carry a person through a storm. The young couple brought a peace lily and no advice, which is how you know good neighbors. Keegan unfolded maps. Luis traced lines in the dust with a carpenter's pencil, turning them into rivers and property lines and years. Abby, Helen's 15-year-old granddaughter, arrived after school, her backpack like a shell, and her attention bright with the particular seriousness of teenagers who understand that adults are performing something more important than performance. "Can I see where she was?" Abby asked. Helen led her to the square in the floor. The sand bore a gentle print where weight had been, the way a bed shows the story of a sleeping person long after they rise. Abby knelt, touched the edge of the square with her fingertips, and closed her eyes. "Hi," she whispered down to the earth. "We don't know your last name yet, but we're working on it." The room breathed with her. There are silences, and then there are silences that function like a vow. "What happens now?" Abby asked, standing. "We find her kin if we can," Helen said. "We ask the city to help pay for a burial in a proper cemetery. We tell her story correctly, so that it is less a ghost story than a ledger corrected. We fix the floor. We grow something in the yard that likes to be near old stories. Lavender, perhaps." "Lavender," Abby said, naming the sprig in the evidence bag. "It's like she left a sticky note in 1880 saying, 'Plant this.'" They laughed, and then they did the work. Keegan spent hours photocopying the names of every Maria in the 1880 death index within a 10-mile radius. Helen wrote letters in longhand to parishes that had once been near St. Bartholomew's, asking whether any record of an infant's funeral would have survived past fire and neglect. Abby searched digitized newspapers after doing her algebra, discovering a small paragraph from May 1880 that read, with the chilling brevity of grief seen from a bureaucrat's desk, "Diphtheria continues among the tenements. The child of M.O. of Delaware Street expired Tuesday last. Interment at St. Bartholomew's." "Delaware Street," Keegan said, eyes lighting. "That's 2 blocks from here, old map. The street was renamed in 1915. That's the old Irish Row. Oh, could be O'Shea." He blew out a breath. "But Del Valle lived on Canal. 2 communities, 1 parish." "Then we honor them both," Helen said, "until we can narrow it." The medical examiner's office prepared a petition for reburial. The city council, alerted by a reporter who was gentle for once and resisted the trap of the word haunted except as a metaphor for civic responsibility, offered a small fund for cemetery fees. 2 cemeteries in Colma expressed willingness, one with a section reserved for pioneer children, which phrase made Helen wince. Pioneers, those who named their taking a virtue. Still, children is what Maria was, and space is what she needed. At night, Helen sat at the dining table beneath the photo of her father and wrote notes that became prayers halfway through without asking her permission. "Maria O'Shea, if that's you," your mother asked the undertaker to polish the ovals. "Did she look in and tell you goodbye or good night? Maria del Valle, if that's you, did your abuela braid your hair and murmur a psalm? Whichever you are, or neither, you are ours now until we put you where your people would have wanted you to be. You were not missed by everyone. Time is cowardly. It looks away, we won't." She folded the note and put it in the shoebox. She added a tiny wooden rosary from the drawer where she kept mother-of-pearl buttons and a spray of lavender Abby had tied with kitchen twine. Across the lid, she wrote a second label, "For the day we bring her home." The day would come. It would not, as it turned out, bring a single name carved with the authority of marble. It would bring instead something more complex and maybe more faithful, a ceremony that allowed multiple names to stand near one another without forcing a choice. A community that decided haunting as a verb was another word for responsibility, and a house that understood its foundation had never been wood and stone alone, but the work of putting things right. The cemetery in Colma stretched like a green sigh under an honest sky. On the appointed morning, the wind carried the smell of cut grass and the institutional coffee, familiar to every gathering where sorrow wears a name tag. The county van arrived without performance. Dr. Morales stepped out first with her clipboard, Then the attendants with their practiced reverence. The lead coffin came last, swaddled in a white pall that someone from the funeral home had ironed with an extra minute's care. It looked in that covering both heavier and lighter, like sadness that has realized it must be borne by many shoulders and has therefore redistributed its weight. Helen stood with Abby to one side, hands linked, a line of women whose ages made a gentle graph of survival. Ms. Patel had closed her shop for the hour and came with her husband, bringing in her purse a little packet of marigold petals, because marigolds had stood guard over her own dead on another continent. Keegan, the retired teacher, held a folded paper that contained remarks which would be brief and not pedantic. Luis leaned against a tree and removed his cap, the sun drawing a silver edge along his dark hair. The priest from St. Bartholomew's, rebuilt and renamed and relocated 3 times since 1880, offered to say a prayer. So did a deacon from the mission parish down the road, and a woman rabbi whose congregants had had their own experience with names being erased. A cantor from the Filipino community sang a hymn that sounded like an island forgiving a shore. None of it felt performative. It felt in the way truly humble ceremonies always do, like a room making space. "We could not confirm a single surname," Dr. Morales said plainly when it was time to begin. "The plate reads Maria. The year appears to be 1880. We think this child belonged either to the Irish Row along Old Delaware Street, or to the Spanish-speaking families along Canal, or perhaps to both in the way neighborhoods share at their seams. We will inscribe her stone as follows, if the community agrees. Maria Mary, beloved child, 1880, found with lavender, brought to light with care. We will list both possibilities beneath. If descendants come forward later with proof, we will add the family name then. But she will not wait any longer to be where the ground knows her." Helen felt something let go in her chest, not grief, which had come to stay, but a measuring. "Yes," she thought, "you do not wait for perfection to do the good. You do not wait for marble to say what mouths can say now." Keegan read from the register, because records can be a form of tenderness when they are read out loud. The 3 Marias, their ages, the undertaker's careful hand. He read the paragraph from the 1880 paper noting the epidemic, and he stopped before editorializing, which is the rarest courtesy a historian can pay to the dead. The priest offered a prayer for the repose of a soul whose name God surely knew, regardless of plate and ink. The deacon read a psalm in Spanish. The rabbi spoke a blessing that commended the child to a rest, both Abrahamic and secular. May her memory be for a blessing. May those who loved her in 1880 be honored by those who found her in 2025. The cantor sang. Ms. Patel whispered a Hindu mantra that asks the soul to move gently to where it is awaited. No one took offense, because offense is a luxury employed by people who have never held a box this small. Helen stepped forward last, the shoebox in her hands. She set it on the grass and opened it, the ribbon, the dish towel, the note, the lavender. She had added one more thing the night before, a small crocheted lace doily her mother had made, browned at the edges by decades of careful use. "I lived above you for 30 years, she said, not amplifying her voice because the dead do not need microphones. "I walked across your ceiling and I made coffee and paid bills and solved crosswords, and once I cried so hard I left my cheek on the floorboards. I'm sorry, we didn't know. Now we do. We brought you out without breaking you. We tried to find your full name and couldn't, but we found your time. Here is your lavender back. Here is a ribbon in case your hair wants remembering. Here is a towel from my kitchen because houses owe each other respect. And here is a note to your mother, wherever she is. We have held your child as carefully as we could." Abby put a photograph into the box, a picture she had printed at the drugstore of the square in the floor, the sand shaped by the outline of the coffin, a tuft of dust like a cloud. On the back she had written, "Your room looked like this when we found it. It was quiet and clean and sad. We will keep it that way in our memory." She looked at the coffin, then at the hole, waiting to receive it. "Good night," she said. "Not goodbye." They lowered the coffin. The ropes paid out slowly, like lines of a poem being released to their meaning. When the box touched earth, a many-voiced murmur slipped along the ring of mourners, not words exactly, but the sound humans make when something aligns. Soil fell, soft at first, then more. The marigold petals scattered bright enough to argue with grief. The stone, temporary at first, marble later, was set. The inscription, penciled in the mason's neat block on a clipboard, was approved by nod and hand squeeze and the solemnity of a granddaughter. As the crowd drifted away, Morales lingered. "We X-rayed the locket," she told Helen quietly, as if to pass along a private fact that could anchor a person. "It contained a coil of hair that did not match the child's. I think it was the mother's. We have a photograph of the X-ray. Would you like a copy?" "I would," Helen said. "I would put it in the kitchen near the calendar, not to dwell, but to remember with usefulness." "Usefulness," Morales repeated, liking the word. "If anyone contacts us with a family Bible entry or a letter, I'll call." They did not immediately, not within the month or the season. But something else happened that was both less and more. The story, told carefully by one reporter and then repeated without distortion by a few others, made people in the city remember how many houses stand on former fields that once were gardens of the dead. It made the council vote to fund better archival work in the cemeteries still holding displaced grief. It made one developer pause long enough to see a map overlaid on his site plan and say, "We'll pay for a survey," which is a small miracle. Money doing penance. Back on Helen Street, life resumed with adjustments. The joists were replaced, the floor was relaid. Luis sanded and sealed the oak until it shone the color of bread. Helen stood at the threshold of the living room and felt something like a blessing. The house now stood on truth, which is a deeper foundation than wood. She hung near the mantel a shadow box with the copy of the coffin plate photograph, the lavender sprig, and the X-ray of the locket's contents, glowing faintly like a lunar phase. Beneath, a card read, "Maria, Mary, 1880. We remember you here." Abby came after school and did homework on the rug, which no longer lifted and fell with the seasons. Ms. Patel brought over gulab jamun when her nephew got into nursing school. They ate it with forks and laughter. Keegan delivered the book he had promised, a binder of maps and clippings with a preface that read, in his careful teacher's hand, "This is for the next family who finds a name under their house and thinks they have found a ghost. You have not. You have found a task." Sometimes, in late afternoon, when the light angled through the window just so, Helen would put the kettle on, take down the shadow box, and dust it the way one dusts a framed photograph of kin. She would think about a woman in 1880, hair pinned tight, palms cracked from washwater, and scrubbing the boards of a kitchen not unlike hers. She would picture that woman cutting a tiny lock from her own head, curling it into a locket, pressing it to her lips, and tucking it near her child's hand, between lavender and prayer. She would speak a sentence Helen's own mother used when she needed courage. "We will do the next right thing." And on the first anniversary of the reburial, a small group gathered at the grave. The stone, now permanent, read, "Maria, Mary, beloved child, 1880, found with lavender, brought to light with care." O'Shea, Del Valle, unconfirmed. They brought more lavender. Abby read a poem she had written that did not rhyme, but did, in its own way, balance. Ms. Patel sprinkled marigold again. Keegan stood with his hat in his hands and said nothing, which was the best way to use his voice that day. Morales came in her blazer and flat shoes and put her palm on the stone with the gentle firmness of a doctor taking a pulse. On the way home, Helen stopped at the nursery and bought 3 lavender plants. Luis, passing in his truck, saw her struggling with the bags and pulled over. He dug the holes, deep as necessary and square at the bottom the way older gardeners insist upon. Abby pressed soil around the roots with hands that would hold babies someday, or pens, or tools, or laws. Helen watered, then stood back. "Why 3?" Abby asked. "One for Maria," Helen said. "One for the mother whose hair was in the locket, and one for all the names we did not find. You plant in odd numbers, when you want the eye to travel and the heart to consider what's missing." They laughed because grief allowed it, because doing the good makes room. That night, Helen sat at the table and wrote one more note. To the next homeowner who finds history under their floorboards: pause, breathe. Call someone who knows what to do. Invite your neighbors to stand with you. Remember that haunting need not mean fear. It can mean obligation. And when you have done what is required, plant something that will remind you to keep memory sweet. She taped the note to the underside of the lowest drawer, the one that sticks in damp weather, because houses inherit not only pictures and clocks, but instructions. She turned off the kitchen light, went to the living room, and placed her hand on the floor where the earth had cradled a child with the patience of a century and a half. "Good night, Maria," she said, using both names because both had asked to be spoken. "We can stand here now." Outside, the wind said nothing melodramatic, just the usual neighborhood conversation in the trees. Inside, the house did what all honest houses do after a season of repair. It rested without apology, held its people without pretense, and kept, under the lacquer and the grain, a faithful memory of what had once been wrong and was, by many hands, many hearts, put right.